Okay. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our next or current seminar on Greek mythology. It's good to be back with you guys. I'm happy to see that you've all returned, and I'm really excited for what we're going to be talking about today, which is the Odyssey. Welcome back. Hi, Evan. Hi, Alette. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Okay, so let's get into it. So today we're going to be talking about the Odyssey, and we touched upon this a little bit last week, but this is the journey that the hero Odysseus took on his way home from the War of Troy to his home in Ithaca. So this is Odysseus, or this is an image that we can imagine of what he might have looked like. Odysseus was a great man, a great hero of old. And in Greek mythology, it's always, there's a contrast between the gods and everything they do and then the mortals. And as far as mortals go, as humans, Odysseus is one of the greatest of us. He was really smart. He was a very crafty, kind of clever man who could work his way out of tough situations. And he always had really clever ideas. He was very witty, but he was also very strong, and he was a great leader. Now, who is this person? This is Hermes. Have you guys heard of Hermes before? Uh-oh. Hello, Jordan. So Hermes is a god, and we're talking about him because Hermes has some relation to Odysseus in his ancestry. They believe he is a descendant of Hermes. And Hermes is the god of travelers, merchants, public speakers, and thieves. And that's interesting that we can have a god of something like thievery, because you wouldn't always think of that as a good thing. But remember, the gods have many human traits and human qualities as well. So Hermes, he's famous for having the sandals or the shoes with wings on them, so he could fly around the globe. And his main job, and when you hear about him a lot in the stories, is as he's the messenger of the gods. So sometimes he'll come into a lot of different stories because he's delivering different messages between the gods and the mortals, or between gods and other gods. But we see him a lot throughout these different stories. And there are some parts of Hermes, or some traits that Hermes has, which are similar to the ones we'll see in Odysseus in the story today. Okay, so this is a big map. Don't worry about all these names. That can get a little confusing. But this is the area where Odysseus lived and sailed and fought. So here you can see in that circled part, this is an island called Ithaca, and that was Odysseus's home. Now over here, we have Troy. So the whole journey of the Odyssey is Odysseus trying to get from Troy back to his home in Ithaca. Now, nowadays, we don't think of that as maybe a long journey. This is just, here we're looking at the land of Greece, and this is, let's see, where would this be? So this is not too far. If we think of flying by plane, this is maybe a couple hours in the air. I'd say two hours at the most. This is a really short trip. You could make this in a weekend and be back home for work on Monday or for school on Monday. But it took Odysseus 10 years to get all the way from Troy back to Ithaca. And we're going to talk about why that was and why it took him so long. So here's another statue of Odysseus. Now, you guys remember Helen of Troy from last week. And what part does she play in this? So remember how, when we were talking about Helen, before she was married to King Menelaus and before she became Helen of Sparta, she was considered the most beautiful woman in the world, and she had a lot of different suitors or different men that wanted to marry her. And Odysseus was one of those men. He didn't marry her, obviously, but he was one of the many who saw her beauty and wanted to have her for his wife. Now, the story of Odysseus and Helen is a really interesting one because Odysseus actually ended up marrying this woman who is a cousin of Helen. Her name was Penelope. But what happened is Odysseus, when he was looking at Helen as a possible wife, he realized when there was so much competition, so many other men, so many great other kings and people, that he probably wouldn't be the one. And he was smart. He would think ahead. So he was worried that with all these different men competing for her hand in marriage, that whoever won, whoever actually got her hand, might become an enemy, and he might be a threat to the other people, or the other suitors might be upset with him and wage war over this woman. And that's kind of a dangerous thing, especially in these times with that many different powerful people and countries represented. So Odysseus proposed an idea to Helen's father, which was essentially to unite the suitors so that whoever ended up marrying Helen, which was King Menelaus of Sparta in the end, that whoever married her, all the other suitors would get behind that person, would support them. So they would be friendly. It became more of a pact and a coalition rather than enemies. So in exchange for organizing that and getting support of all the suitors amongst each other, Odysseus married Penelope. And Penelope, though not the most beautiful woman in the world, like Helen, she was obviously very beautiful, as you can see, but she was also very intelligent. She was smart and cunning, very much like Odysseus. So they were better matched for each other in terms of their minds. Okay, and Achilles. Now we're backing up our story a little bit to before Troy. Let's go back even before that. So Odysseus and Penelope are married. They live on the island of Ithaca together, and they have a good life. Odysseus has a lot of land. He has a house. He has crops. He's a pretty wealthy man. He's a leader in that part in Ithaca. He's the king of Ithaca, actually. And he has a small boy, a young child named Telemachus, who is just a baby. And that is when the War of Troy begins, and King Menelaus comes and starts recruiting his people. And Menelaus comes and gets Odysseus on board and convinces him so much to come and fight with him, because it's kind of a band of honor, And then Odysseus was actually the one who recruited Achilles to come and fight in the War of Troy, because he knew they would need the best warriors, and Achilles was known to be the best warrior. Now, this picture we see here is a funny story, because Achilles' mother, do you remember, she dipped him in the river, and that's why he became immortal. Now, she had received a prophecy, which is something that tells you of the future. And Achilles' mother had been told that if he goes to Troy, he's going to die. And she didn't want her son to die. So when she heard that all these warriors were being taken to go fight in the Battle of Troy, she tried to hide her son. And this is Achilles here. And she tried to hide him by dressing him up in women's clothing and pretending that he was a woman so that he wouldn't be found and taken. But then Odysseus, who we see here, came up with a plan, or so the story goes, where he had all these women together, and they knew Achilles was one of them, but he wouldn't reveal which one. So he had somebody sound off a horn, like a warning signal or a call to battle. So if the enemy ships were coming in, you would have a battle horn that you would blow, and you could hear it across the land. And then all the men would gather their spears and their weapons, and they would come to fight, to protect. So Odysseus had someone blow that horn, and then only one woman in the group reacted and started putting on their armor and looking for weapons to go and fight. And so they knew it was Achilles. And then they grabbed him and recruited him to come and fight in the Trojan War as well. That's just a funny story about Odysseus and the kind of man he was. He would always come up with clever plans or clever solutions to things. Yes, Penelope is very pretty, Natalie. Okay, moving on. Now this is the Trojan Horse. And we talked about this last week, but just to bring it back up again, it was Odysseus. He was the one who came up with this idea. That's another example. He was a very great warrior and a very strong leader, but ultimately he was a very crafty and smart individual. Okay, now let's look at the journey Odysseus took. So over here, we have Troy. Can you guys see that? And to get home to his island of Ithaca, you see, all he should have had to do was just follow this blue arrow here. And that wouldn't be a long journey. I mean, it's quite a ways to sail, but it's not 10 years worth. So what happened? So let's talk about it. The first place he went was Sycones. And you can see that over here, they've got it numbered very nicely for us. And we'll talk about each one of these. So this is believed to be the beginning of his troubles because they found people here, but they were not friendly. They essentially fought with them because they needed food and supplies, but instead of a harmony or an agreement between people where they could trade or whatever, it became a battle. And they ended up killing, I believe, all of these people or most of them in this city. And that was believed to have angered the gods. So from that point, Odysseus was trying to sail home to Ithaca, but it's believed that a storm created by Zeus, who was upset with the way Odysseus treated these people, also with the way he was not thankful or not thankful enough to the gods at the end of the Battle of Troy. We're not sure exactly what. It's different sources tell us different things, but we believe that Zeus was angered and then created a storm that was so intense that it took Odysseus way off course. So instead of going up here to Ithaca like he wanted to, he was blown all the way over here to the land of the Lotus eaters. Now, what is the Lotus? This is a painting of the Lotus. And here's a really interesting idea, because the land of the Lotus eaters was this place where men would go and you would have one bite. You would just have one petal of this flower and you would forget who you are. You would forget almost everything. You wouldn't want, it's so hard to imagine because you forget who you are. You forget what you believe in. You forget what you care about. And the only thing that becomes important to you after you eat this flower is eating more of the flower. So when Odysseus went here, it was very dangerous because he sent his men in to see what this place was like, and they ate some of the flower, and then they were lost, and they didn't come back to the ship, and Odysseus had to go and find them. And luckily, he saw what was happening before he himself ate the flower, and he was able to take his men and force them back to the ship and take them away. But the men who ate it essentially refused. They no longer looked up to him as a leader or as a friend. They no longer cared about getting home to their families. They just wanted to stay there and continue eating this plant. So here's a really interesting point about this story overall, about the Odyssey, is that things like this, the lotus plant, for example, they can represent things that are in the real world even today. Like these people, this land of the lotus eaters, you can think of as a forgetful place, a place where people are addicted just to eating this plant. And that's a hugely powerful idea and something to think with today. Like, you have yourself and what you believe in, your family, what's important to you, what you love. Could you imagine something just like a flower being so powerful that it could make you forget all that and make you not know who you were and not know what you believed in and only care about staying in one place and just eating this flower forever? Can you think of some things that are like that? It's a question to ask because we see these stories recreated in the world today. But as far as our story of Odysseus goes, he didn't lose all his men to the lotus plant, just some of them. But he brought the others back and left the land quickly once he realized how dangerous it was. So from there, he went to what we believe is Sicily, known as Sicily today, which was the land of the Cyclops. Now, here is a picture of a Cyclops. And the Cyclops in the story of Odysseus was named Polyphemus, and he was a son of Poseidon. Now, the Cyclops people who lived on this island, they were simple people, but they were rather brutal. So this Cyclops in particular, he raised sheep, and he lived in a cave, and he was a shepherd, but he wasn't friendly toward Odysseus. He preferred to just keep to himself, and he wasn't interested in trading or in making friends. So when Odysseus showed up, luckily they came in early, and the Cyclops was out. He was out in the fields, and they found his sheep, and they were hungry, so they ate some. And when he returned, the Cyclops was upset, so he trapped them in his cave by moving a giant stone in front of the opening, and it was so big that none of the men could move it. None of them could get out. And the Cyclops started eating Odysseus's men. He would have 2 for dinner, and then he was going to have 2 for breakfast. But Odysseus came up with a plan on how to escape. And he and his men took a large branch, almost the size of a tree, and they used the fire, and they used what they had in the cave to make it into a spear. And then Odysseus stabbed him in the eye and blinded him. And now that made the Cyclops even more mad, as you can imagine. But what he did after that was the next morning, when he was moving the rock to let his sheep out into the pasture to graze, Odysseus had every single man crawl under a sheep and hide in their fur and hold on. So as the sheep went out, the Cyclops felt them, and it was just the sheep who were escaping, and he didn't feel any men. And then by the time they were all gone, it was too late. And Odysseus' men, they all ran back to the ship, and they were able to escape. But like I said, this Cyclops, Polyphemus, he was the son of Poseidon. And being blinded or blinding the sun was not something Poseidon looked on very friendly, or he wasn't very appreciative of that. So he essentially continued to curse Odysseus' journey and make it tough for him to get home. And this is really the reason why it took so long, because Odysseus angered the gods one after the other. Essentially started with Zeus, and now it's Poseidon. And they gave him more and more really tough things to get through in order to make it home. Okay. So from the land of the Cyclops, we traveled to Aeolus. And this is Aeolus, and he is the god of the winds. Now, initially, Odysseus had a friendly relationship with him, and they worked out an agreement together where, you see, he has this bag on the top of his head. He was doing Odysseus a favor, and he took all the winds of the world and put them into this bag, except for one. The one wind he left still out and still blowing was the one that would carry Odysseus home. So Odysseus thanked him, of course, and he was made responsible for this bag. So Aeolus gave him the bag with all the winds, and he said, sail home, and when you reach home, open the bag, and then all the winds will return to where they should be, and things go back to normal. But until then, I'll just leave this one wind to take you home. But as they were sailing back, Odysseus didn't tell his men what was in the bag, and they grew suspicious. They thought that he had been given a gift of gold and riches, and they wanted it. They wanted some for themselves. So they opened the bag mid-journey, and it released all the winds, and then they didn't make it home, and they were carried all the way back to the land of Aeolus. So when they returned, we have to remember people lived by different codes than they do now. What we think of as right and wrong today may have been thought of in a completely different way back then. And there was a different sense of honor and what's expected between people. So when Aeolus put all the winds in the bag and gave Odysseus a fair passage home, that was a gift. That was a true gift. That was a favor. And when Odysseus disrespected that and let the winds out of the bag and then was blown all the way back, that was a dishonorable thing. He was taking the gift that was given to him, and he was looking on it. He wasn't showing respect for it. He wasn't honoring that. So when he returned to the island after having made that mistake, he was attacked. There are these actual giants in the story, and they threw rocks at Odysseus' fleet and at his ships, and they actually destroyed almost all the ships except for the one Odysseus was on. So he lost most of his crew at this time. Okay. Next, he comes over here. You see where it says number 9? This is Aea. Probably not pronouncing that exactly right. But on this island was where a nymph named Circe lived. And she was a daughter of Helios. And this is Circe. And she had magical powers, essentially mystical type powers, where she could turn humans into animals. And as the story goes, she turned all of Odysseus' crew into pigs when they arrived. But Odysseus was lucky, and Hermes came to him with something that would cure him, or not cure him, but keep him so that he could not be affected by her powers. So while the rest of his men were turned into pigs, he remained himself. And that was something nice that the gods did for Odysseus. Throughout the story, it's a lot of anger from the gods, which you see towards him, but there are also these favors they do as well. And Hermes bringing him this cure, or this protection, was one of those favors. So what happened with Circe is she found that when Odysseus was resistant or impenetrable to her magic, she was attracted to that, and she fell in love with him. And because of that, he was able to convince her to turn all of his men back into men, which she did. And then they ended up staying on her island actually for a year. And this is a really interesting part of the story, because why would they stay there for a year? I don't know. In some ways they were celebrating, they were maybe taking a break, because most of the time they were feasting. She was a nymph, partial goddess, but partial immortal. And she had a lot of wealth, so they enjoyed themselves. And Odysseus lived with her, essentially, for that time. But eventually it ran out, and Odysseus knew he had to get back home. And so he left. And Circe advised him that if he was going to make it home, he needed to travel first to the underworld. That's where Hades lives. You know Hades, I'm sure. So that's where we travel to next. This is a picture, some artist's idea of Hades. Now, in the underworld, a lot transpired, but Odysseus was given a sort of prophecy or a warning about the things he would face next and what it would take. So it's very dangerous for a mortal to go here, and they don't usually, but he did, and he was able to converse with spirits of the underworld, and they gave him a warning of what he was about to face. So the first of those things is here, where it says number 10, and those are the Sirens. Now the Sirens, these are one of my favorite parts of the whole Odyssey story, because it's something that I think is very relevant and very noticeable even in the world today. So the Sirens are, here you can see in the picture, they're these angel-type creatures, and they have the power of this voice, which is an enchanting voice. And whenever they sing, anybody who hears the song becomes completely mesmerized, and they lose track of themselves, and all they want to do is follow the song and go towards the Sirens, and that's all they can think about. They're just so strongly attracted to the song, or to the magic of it, or to the mystical aspect of it. It's almost hypnotic. Like, to hypnotize is essentially the same thing. It's to get someone's mind just following one command. So when these Sirens sing, they're actually evil, because they sit on these jagged rocks here, and they sing, and sailors that are passing by, who just want to sail through peacefully, get distracted. they hear the song and they lose their minds, and then they sail themselves into the rocks and crash and die. So while they look like angels, and in a sense they are angels of a sort, it's actually a very, very dark thing and a very dangerous enemy. So Odysseus has all of his men stuff their ears with wax before they go through so that they can't hear the song. But he wants to hear the song. So you can see in this picture here, he's tied himself, or he's had the crew tie him to the mast. And he ordered them before they got there. He said, no matter what I say, no matter what I do while we sail through here, don't listen to me. Just sail straight through. Don't take the wax out of your ears. And they say, okay. So while the men are sailing through, they can't hear the song of the Sirens. But as they're passing, Odysseus hears it. And for that moment, while they're passing through, he loses his mind. And he's trying to tell them, he's like, we have to go. We have to go towards the song. Trust me, untie me, please. I lied. You need to listen to me. I've changed my mind. But his men know that he's just under the influence of that song. So they won't do it, and they sail through safely. So Odysseus was only able to make it through because he had knowledge of the Sirens. He was told in the underworld that they would be there and what their song does to people. So he was able to safely avoid it. But why I like this part of the story so much is because this idea of the Sirens, or of some song or something pulling you kind of in a really strong, overpowering way towards you it's something you can see a lot in the world today. And it's just something you should think about, what can represent the song of the Sirens for you or for other people? What do you see people being called towards so strongly it seems hypnotic or obsessive? So these are the Sirens. But Odysseus in the story made it through safely. Now, if you can see on the map here, the next place he had to go, he was trying to pass through what we now call Italy and Sicily. So if you look, you guys know, if you know your geography, Italy is often referred to as kind of a boot kicking a ball. So passing through here in the story of the Odyssey, Odysseus had to pass right through the middle of a very narrow strait, which is just a part of water, which is surrounded very closely by other pieces of land. So he had to pass through this really small area, and on either side there were two very dangerous enemies. So here on one side we have the monster Scylla, and on the other side we have this whirlpool, which is Charybdis. Again, I'm sorry for my pronunciation. But as he sails through, Odysseus has to make the choice. Which of these do we want to face? Do we want to face the whirlpool and be sucked down into the depths of the ocean? Or do we want to face this six-headed monster, Scylla, who's going to eat us? And he makes a choice. And this is another clever thing Odysseus does, but it's also a bit dark, because he knows there's really no way to win. Because if they go in the whirlpool, they're going to get sucked down, their ship is going to get destroyed. And if they go to Scylla, she's going to eat them. So how do you get through? There's no other way around. He just must pass straight through. So what he does is he guides the boat closer toward Scylla and away from Charybdis, or the whirlpool, and he lets some of his men get eaten. But as you'll notice, she only has 6 heads. So each one of these heads grabs a man and eats them, but they're only able to kill 6 of his crew because she only has the 6 heads. So this is interesting as for Odysseus as a leader, because you would think you wouldn't want to let any of your men go. He's already lost many in this journey, and that's one thing. It's a really tough journey, so it's hard to make these calls. But you have to imagine the kind of person you'd have to be to say, okay, this is going to get us through, but we're going to lose these people. That's really a tough call to make, and it's something that Odysseus was very good at. So in a way, he's very heroic and a very good leader, but he's also got this darker side of being able to face those situations and make calls like this. Okay. The next place they went is here, number 13, Thrinacia, and this is the island of Helios. And Helios is the sun god. And on this island, Helios kept his cattle, and they were very, very important to him. So Odysseus was again warned when he passed this island not to touch the cattle, because Helios, he's a god. And again, you don't want to anger the gods. And it was a very clear thing that these are Helios's cattle and they are not to be messed with. But when they passed through and they stopped on the island, Odysseus didn't know, but some of his men went and killed the cattle. They were hungry. What could they be expected to do? You could say they were ignorant. Who knows? But this deeply upset Helios because the cows were very important to him. So he asked Zeus to punish those who had eaten the cattle, which was most of Odysseus's crew. And what happened then was he created such a storm that it destroyed their ship and it killed all of the crew. And Odysseus only survived because he clung to a piece of wood and drifted over here to Ogygia Isle, which is where he met Calypso. Here's a picture of Odysseus and Calypso. And Calypso is another nymph, and she also, like Circe, fell in love with Odysseus. And Odysseus was actually stuck here with her for 7 years. Now, that's a long time to be with someone. And Calypso didn't want to let him go because she really was in love with Odysseus. And since the gods were upset with him, there was nobody who was willing to come and help. They just sort of left him there. For Calypso, it was a very nice thing because she had this man, she had company. He was a friend. He was a great man. But for Odysseus, he still wanted to be home. He was still trying desperately to get back to Ithaca, but now he had no way to get there. He had no ship, no crew, nothing. So while he was, being stuck on an island with a goddess, it's probably not a bad thing, but his mind is somewhere else. He's stuck on trying to get home to his wife, Penelope, and his son, Telemachus, who at this point has been growing up into a man, and he hasn't been anywhere to see it. So for all this time, Odysseus is trying to get back, but he has no way. And finally, I forget which god. I believe Athena was the one who stood up for him, but someone gave him a chance. They gave him enough material to build a raft and to sail away. And the next place he went was Phaeacia. And this is this island up here, very close to Ithaca. And here he met some really friendly and honorable people, the Phaeacians. And they were also great sailors. They had some of the best ships of the time. So after Odysseus spent an evening with them and told them his story and exchanged, a very friendly, made a very friendly relationship with them, they helped him and they gave him a boat and a crew and they returned him to his home in Ithaca. So this whole passage that Odysseus went on, that took 10 years. And remember, this is 10 years following the 10 years that he spent in Troy. But when he finally gets home to Ithaca, here you can see a picture of him, and that would be his wife, Penelope. But during this whole time, it's not a happy ending just yet, because while Penelope has been home alone, raising Telemachus, there have been suitors who are trying to marry her. Because when Odysseus didn't return home from Troy in the time that the other warriors did, they assumed he was gone. They assumed he had died somewhere in passage. So Penelope, for years and years and years, refused. But she also did it in a very smart way, because she knew these men could be dangerous or they could force her into something. So she said, I'm going to weave this tapestry. And she did it by hand. So all day she would spend weaving this tapestry. And she said, when I'm done, when I finish my tapestry, then I will marry one of you. So all day she would spend weaving, and the suitors would come to Odysseus' house, and they would wait, and they would talk, and they would hang out there. And then they would leave, and at night, she would stay up all night and unweave everything she had done. so that she could essentially endlessly carry out this waiting process. And that was the game she played with the suitors. And it worked for a while, but as the story goes, they eventually put her on the spot and said, enough lying, you must choose. And she refused. And that was when, as luck would have it, Odysseus returned home. And now remember, Odysseus is a warrior of warriors. He's a great fighter. He's a leader of men in battle. And so when he came home and he found all these men trying to marry his wife, he wasn't very happy about it. And he killed most of them. They fought, and he and Telemachus fought, and most of the suitors were killed, and the rest ran away. And then after that, he was able to return to his peaceful life that he had before. And though he missed 20 years of it, he now had a son who was a very young, grown man, and he had his wife back, and he had his land back, and he was home. So that's the story of the Odyssey and Odysseus' journey. So if you guys have any questions, throw them in the Q&A now, and we'll take them up. Otherwise, I'm just going to say a little more, and then we'll wrap this up. So this story, it's a story involves a lot of different gods and a lot of different forces that are kind of beyond our control. Thank you. That was a good story. I agree. And here's why I think it's such a good story, is because this isn't, to me, this isn't just, it's not just a story. It's almost like a map, you know. I believe that the Odyssey that Odysseus went on, this journey, is something that we all go on, you know. There's an internal journey for all of us, and there are challenges that each of us face that are going to be completely different from other people. And I believe this story has stuck around for so long because it's so true for so many of us. And while Odysseus was fighting these gods and these evil monsters and cunning, you know, magical creatures, we have things in our life which are kind of represented by those in the story. I hope that's not too confusing. It's just, what you want to do with a tale like this is not just let it be imaginary. You want to try and imagine how it can be real, like the Sirens or the Lotus eaters, or like Circe trying to manipulate people to turn men into animals. What if instead of turning men actually into animals, you turn their minds into animal minds so they don't think clearly? They act, you know, dangerous or aggressive. If there's a person in your life or in the world that you see who can turn people into acting like animals, you see how that's kind of related to the Odyssey, to these tales that Odysseus went through. So I would encourage you guys to all read up on this on your own. You know, there are tons of different variations or different renditions of this story that go from easier to more intricate and more in depth. But it's a really great one, and it's one that's one of the most well-known stories, I would say, for our whole humanity, all the people that are on this world. So thank you guys very much for tuning in and listening. I hope that you enjoyed this webinar on Greek mythology, and I will see you guys again soon. But for now, take care and read as many stories as you can. That's what I encourage. Every Greek myth, every story that sounds interesting to you, just read it and then think about how it can be real in your life, because that's the magic of these stories. Okay, that's all for now. I'll see you guys later.